So to understand today, one must understand yesterday. And to me, I mean yesterday as what occurred after the assassination of John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, and Martin Luther King. I view this in terms of a counter coup against a progressive movement, or a movement against multinational business interests, or multinationalism for that fact. Richard Nixon gets in, his platform is law and order. That's because there's race riots all over the country, anti-war protests, civil rights marches, all kinds of civil unrest that was touched off by the assassinations. The young people in this country wanted change. They were idealistic. They just didn't follow lockstep into what the leaders told them. Many of the leaders, like my father, were products of World War II, where they served their country without question, no matter what. This tradition goes clear back to the feudal system, where the knights had to follow their barons and earls when called, and all the knights' people that he sponsored had to follow him. And it went right on down the line to archers, pikemen, etc. But if the monarch or some landed bigwig wanted to exercise power, he could, and he had a certain group of people that were obligated by oath to follow him. Later on, when the feudal economy started changing, these people were replaced by mercenaries, but there was still a matter of property and a matter of power, etc. Well, the property interests wanted to take over South Vietnam, or actually Southeast Asia, from the French when they were pulling out. The French had to pull out of Algeria, well, generally North Africa, and also their Southeast Asian possessions, whatever. They were restricting the colonialist approach that they had. So in order to gobble up what the French were going to abandon, we started drafting and sending troops to Southeast Asia, at that time called Vietnam, because we didn't want Oriental interests cutting into the profits there and cutting into the particularly opium production, but also the rubber trade and things like this. So it's complicated. And we started the war in Vietnam, and it got out of control. Mainly it was to keep a certain party in power that were alleged or allegiant to the French. Well, then the assassination started happening, then the unrest started happening, and a lot of the citizens of this country were fearful. A lot of it was racial. They thought their white daughters would get raped by black men. Part of it was economic. They thought the great one wars would take over their jobs and things like this. Minorities would take over their jobs. Mongolian hordes, or the equivalent nowadays, would come in and disrupt things. And they were really scared. Well, they had a savior, Richard Nixon, who came and said, I'll restore things. I'll restore law and order. I'll put down this dissension so that we can feel safe. And the public bought it. So one of the things he had to do was make good on his law and order promise. The problem is, up until then, that the federal government had very little to do with local, state, regional law enforcement. It was a local matter. And there was a lot of dissension over that at the time. One of the biggest dissensions was that over search and seizure. And the big argument, overall argument there, was do federal standards of due process apply to the state in their execution of criminal laws? So there are all kinds of cases, starting with one called Mapp versus Ohio, were in that era, that the states chafed at. The other one was the Miranda case, the Escobedo case, things involving rights of defendants in the criminal process, about search and seizure, interrogation, arrest, etc. And there was a great thought that the federal government was trying to encroach on the state's power to define crime and set their criminal standards, etc. Well, Nixon capitalized on that, and he got all kinds of reform. And the end result of this reform was changing our whole legal system from an accusatorial common law system to that of an inquisitorial system. So I've talked about this in the past in some of the other talks that I've had, and I wanted to get into the more subtle changes. Like, for instance, there was the idea since Magna Carta that the purpose of a bail was to only ensure somebody's presence in court. Now, the Napoleonic system, anybody who was arrested was put under bail and had to answer to the bond or to the bail while the investigation was going on. So as soon as the investigation was started, the defendant was summoned and had to post a bail to make sure he was in the jurisdiction until it had finished. Under common law, we trusted people and we let them post bond and then go about their lives, and the bond would only ensure that when the judge said show up in court, the guy showed up in court. Because in our system, everyone was presumed to be innocent until proven guilty. In the Napoleonic system, everybody was assumed to be sort of a bad guy, and it was up to the inquisitors to prove that he was or wasn't. So if you're assumed to have broken the law or to have been a bad guy, it makes sense for you to have to put up some form of guarantee that you'll show up in court and maybe won't do harm to others. This wasn't the case in the United States, or in the free world actually, until Richard Nixon. And his Attorney General, John Mitchell, made one comment publicly that the public in this country would never go for preventive detention. Yet 20 or 30 years later, that's what we have. We have detention hearings, we have detainment, we have conditions of bond where you have to check in as though you're on probation, all kinds of restrictions as soon as a person is arrested. Well, that gives a lot of power to the police and to the justice administrators to screw around with people, harass them, make them do whatever they want. And not only that, it also gave an opportunity for predatory behavior of various corporations. For instance, they said that drugs were a problem. Most people committing offenses did so while taking drugs. So they had a rule that if you were arrested, put on bond, you'd have to go piss in a bottle every once in a while and pay a private piss gatherer a certain amount of money to run an analysis to show that the piss contained no marijuana or other drugs. Some people got pissed off. Anyway, same way with breath tests and a few other things. Well, that's invasion. It's an illegal search. They called it voluntary. Well, if it's voluntary, if you don't volunteer to go for it, then you have to volunteer to go back to jail as a condition of violating your bond. I don't know how the hell they can call that voluntary, but judges have a different vocabulary than the rest of us, I think. In any event, that was one of the things they had. Then they had other preventive detention measures. If they thought you were a flight risk or a danger, then you had to be confined in what they call pretrial release, which is what used to be called jail up until the powers changed the nomenclature. So there are a lot of cases that happened where a person was on bond but detained until the trial occurred. I don't see any difference between that and having convicted somebody and putting them under probation. But the press and business interests and government conspired to mislead the public to the effect that that was a protected device and it was legal, etc. It flied in the face of 10 centuries since Magna Carta. But that's just a little technicality. That's kind of an old law anyway. Not only did they change the concept of guilt, the burden of proof to prove guilt, they wanted to make sure that there wasn't any cross-fertilization from the public or the community. So when I first started practicing law, prosecutors and judges were randomly selected or took jobs for a while and then returned to the legal community. They were always part of the community. They weren't separate and apart from community. I used to have lunches with judges. I used to have lunch with prosecutors, etc. I haven't really had a lunch with a judge or even spoken privately with a judge probably since 1980. They're above me, I guess. The same way with prosecutors. And they didn't even make an effort to try to see other sides of things. Then they institutionalized it even more by putting in a state-run defender system. So all the people, the players in the court system, in the criminal court system, are all governmental employees subject to governmental rules, regulations, training, etc. And don't forget the training, that's very important. And they train not what's justice or to question what justice is, but how to administer cases. So you'll see, and if you interview public defenders, you'll see the same thing. They'll triage their cases. They'll make deals on their cases, and every once in a while they'll go to trial on a case after they got rid of all of what they call the bullshit cases. Now, they don't really use this nomenclature because I would imagine most defendants would be insulted if their cases were publicly referred to as bullshit cases. But that's the case. In the meantime, fear was marketed more intensely year by year by the federal government, and they reinforced it by various TV programs, the law and order type stuff, Treasury, what was it, some sort of O'Hara, I guess, Treasury, Miami Vice type things about drugs, etc. And it's really interesting because they used the whole drug war to set up a war scenario where they changed the rules, changed the definitions, and changed the nature of policing. All of a sudden, drugs were dangerous. They had been, but nobody made that big a deal out of it. And the monster theories kept coming back, that it was dangerous and it was dangerous for it to be out there, and that the government police had a responsibility to protect the citizenry from the drug menace, which to me seemed ironic since most of the drug cases I had handled at that time involved government officials that were smuggling in order to purchase, to get money to buy weaponry to support little wars like in the Central American area where they had the Contras, where they were fighting Viet Cong, in Southeast Asia, etc. So from my point of view, at least, the government was marketing drugs, selling fear to create the market, and then using the money that they got from the drug sale to enlarge their police department and their stranglehold on the American public. And a good part of that budget was for propaganda and things such as this: training the police, indoctrinating the police with a certain dogma, and indoctrinating the citizenry. And just to make sure they control the educational system, they put police in various schools to indoctrinate them about the evils of drugs and how bad it was, etc., but not bothering to talk about the evils of the state infiltration and impingement on rights and the change of our judiciary system, skewing it to the benefit of corporate America and corporations and corporate executives, away from that of the people. As I mentioned in an earlier talk about jury nullification, that was intentional, and it was a good thing because it kept the arrogant administrators, the arrogant bureaucrats, from just totally ignoring the public, ignoring the people. And all of this was being eaten away slowly. And I'll talk about more on that tomorrow. Have a good afternoon.